Well, ladies and gentlemen, here I am with number 7. Okay, then now it's a repeat. I remember when I was at school, teachers of a nasty disposition, when you would do those weekly writing exercises, I think they just called them exercise books. If it wasn't very good, they'd say repeat. And there was supposed to be some good affected by that, and maybe there was. But I had a look at my number 7 the other day and I thought, look, that really is not good. I kept on talking about the crossing, and here I am trying to distinguish between two crossings and referring to one as the crossing. I thought, oh gee, repeat. So I thought I'd better have another go at it. Okay, then now, well, I'll get that over there now. The point of number 7 was to make an assertion. And my assertion is this, that the town began near the upper crossing. The upper crossing, that's the one at the bottom of Burke Street, not at Gowrie Crossing, and that you can actually pinpoint the exact point at which the town began, if you can define the beginning of the town by the location of the very first building. Now, that's what I say. Now, that idea hasn't been very fashionable now for, 55 years, something like that. We'll have another go. No, 75 years, I think. It's not been a fashionable idea. And as I say, once you make an error, it can well be that the error becomes a truth, because if you make an error, it can be repeated so often that it comes to be regarded as a truth. And so I think that that's in fact what happened here. And it leads me to make an assertion that, well, if I were to make it in Charleville, maybe I should have a fast car available. Or would I dare to say it in the bar of the Cattle Camp Hotel? I probably wouldn't, because it's not the received idea. But let me talk about it. I insist that the settlement did not begin at Gowrie Crossing. And you don't have to spend very much time thinking about it. I mean, who would have built there, and what has been there, and what's the evidence of there having been there? But the story was accurately told for quite a number of years. For instance, if I go back to Thomas McMahon's work, now, as you know, I haven't said anything kind about Thomas McMahon's work because, for the most part, there was just a lot of nonsense there. But he didn't make the mistake of saying that the town began at Gowrie Crossing. He seemed to suggest that prior to 1868, when he thought the town was founded, by Tully's survey and so on, he thought that it was at Gowrie, and I take it by that he means the Gowrie Run or the Gowrie Station, and that's accurate enough. Then if we go to the next person who talks about this, that's 1929, and that's the Charleville Times article. It was printed in January 1947, but it was a reprint from the Western Sun of 1929. Now, that purported to be the result of an interview with Louisa Adrian. Now, remember, Louisa Adrian was the daughter of Mary Janetzky. Now, Mary got to Charleville with her husband Lewis in 1866, and eventually the property that they acquired there passed on to Louisa, and Louisa married Mr. Adrian, and that's how Louisa Janetzky became known as Mrs. Adrian. And this 1929 article was, in fact, an interview with Louisa Janetzky, Louisa Adrian. And she died in 1937. But when she was interviewed in 1929, she knew what she was talking about. And the part of the interview that I've kept here is, in most respects, perfectly accurate. She really did know what she was talking about. But whoever her interviewer or her amanuensis was, since I believe her sight was not all that good at that point, Her amanuensis made a very silly mistake, I don't know how, but he said that her father was Louis Gansky, Gantzke. But let's leave the name error aside, because she said that he had a hotel and she called it the First Hotel, which is not quite right. And it was the first one was kept by Robert Cooper, and that was then, they said, acquired by the Janetskys. But in other respects, she's pretty well on the ball. And this is what she says. She says, Charleville was surveyed as a township in 1868. Well, they got mixed up with that year, but it was repeated over and over, and so that's part of it. Was with the Janetskys that era began, but let's not get upset about that. She says that Charleville was surveyed in 1868 as a township. It had been part of Gowrie Station. That is perfectly true, because when the town was gazetted in 1865 in January, it specified in giving the limits of the reserve. The reserve was limited by the definition that you found in the Gazette, and it insisted in that Gazette that it was excluded from and excised from what they called the existing run, which of course was Gowrie Station. And so, anyway, on we go. She talks about Surveyor Tully. They had the year wrong. She says it was named by Tully. Now, she wouldn't have known that because, well, no one knows now and no one knew then. But the Janetskys did tend to affect a certain familiarity with Tully, which they could not have had. But anyway, she goes on and she says that, Tully named Charleville. He named it after his hometown in Ireland. Alfred Street he named after the Duke of Edinburgh and so on. Now, all of that's true. And so apart from the date, I think, and apart from the fact that her father's name was given as Gansky, that's okay. The real era began in 1938. Now, Mrs. Adrian, that's Louise Janetzky, died in 1937. And for some reason, maybe to mark the 70th anniversary of the so-called 1968 naming of the town and the surveying of the town and the blocks and that sort of thing, or perhaps just accidentally, it happened to be about a year after Louisa Adrian's death. Father Flynn decided to write a couple of articles. I think there may have been 3 in the series, but the third one I can't find because that edition of the Charleville Times seems maybe to have been lost. But he wrote 2 anyway that you can find, and one of them, of course, no, they're both called The First 25 Years. But that's when this business of Charleville beginning at Gowrie Crossing began. And so he says this is Father Flynn. And what Father Flynn says surprises me a little bit, and what subsequently Alan Morrison says surprises me a little bit, because they both lived in the town. They had eyes. They walked up and down Alfred Street. They could see what they could see, and they could see what was in Alfred Street. And yet, the evidence of their eyes, well, it didn't deceive them. They were deceived by something else. But anyway, let me move on, and I'll explain that in a moment. This is what Father Flynn says. Now, Father Flynn, I don't know who Father Flynn would have been talking to, because maybe it was one of Louisa Adrian's children. It could be that. But anyway, he says that he got the information, and we take it from the Janetskys, and he says, Mr. Tully came to Charleville in 1868. He arrived at Gowrie Crossing in early 1868 and put up at the Janetzky Hotel. On the first day he went out and walked about the present site of the town, and next day came to the conclusion that the town site should be surveyed between the top crossing, that I usually call the upper crossing, the top crossing, Miller's Crossing, behind the present powerhouse, and Gowrie Crossing. The work took several weeks, and there was a little rum spilt at the town's naming. He called the town site Charleville after his own native town Charleville in County Cork. Well, that's enough. What I'm concerned about is the fact that we don't worry about the year. He says that Louis Janetzky arrived at Gowrie Crossing, or not Louis Janetzky, Mr. Tully arrived at Gowrie Crossing, and he put up at the Janetzky Hotel. So he was saying the Janetzky Hotel, which we all know was the very first building in town, was therefore at Gowrie Crossing. Okay then. Well, then we move on, and this era is repeated. A few years later, probably 1947, Alan Morrison had two versions of his history here. He produced one in 1945, and then he updated it for the centenary celebrations of 1947. And you can see that he did it in a bit of a rush, because you can see he's taken additional information from a couple of other sources. Maybe from Father Flynn, but certainly from the 1929 article. And if he'd stuck to the content of the 1929 article, that would have been fine. But he didn't. Well, if he stuck to most of the content, but he picked up the business about Louis Janetzky being Louis Gansky, or Mrs. Adrian's father being called Louis Gansky. And that's what Morrison says in his 1945-1947 work. But he also picks up not what Mrs. Adrian said for that 1929 article. He picks up what Father Flynn said in 1938 for his article. And what Mr. Morrison says was this. He says, a small township had sprung up at Charleville as a result of the drought in the Roma district in 1868. And that township of Charleville had sprung up at Gowrie Crossing. And he goes on to define it. It consisted substantially of a store owned by Mr. Charles, a man unknown to history, and later by Mr. Skinner. Well, later on there was a Mr. Skinner with a store. And a hotel, this is at Gowrie Crossing, owned by Louis Gansky, whose daughter, Mrs. Adrian, was the first white child born in Charleville. Well, let's not get involved in that. And so Alan Morrison goes on and he says that the town was surveyed by Tully in 1868 and so on. But my concern is this. Both Father Flynn and Alan Morrison said that the town began at Gowrie Crossing. And this was picked up since when people came to write articles about the history of Charleville for the internet. And I think it was basically the internet that they were writing for. They picked up this business of the town beginning. A town had sprung up at Gowrie Crossing. We'll say 1868. And some people actually quote that very phrase, a town had sprung up. In fact, I think, what's her name? Claire Wagner uses that very phrase, had sprung up. And so there the story began, or the era began, and so the era was repeated. And if we assume that that era has been repeated on the internet for the last, 30, 40 years, something like that, it's the example of the old era being repeated unquestioned for some years, and eventually it becomes a truth. But I say no, that didn't happen at all. And so let me explain why I say what I say. I say that you can prove without any doubt at all where the township began simply by going to two sources. One is Chester's map, town, survey plan that's numbered C1401, and linking that with the newspaper reports of the period from 1865 through to 1866, in which the licensees of the pub that was there applied for their licenses, and they had to describe the building in which they were going to conduct their business. Well, let me deal with that latter point first, the building. Now, we know that, Churton, writing in early February of 1865, asserted that when Tully was there in 1864, there had been a caravanserai, a hotel. He didn't describe it in any way, he just said that there was a hotel there. But he did that, I think, very early in February of 1865. But also in 1865, later in February, Brownlow applied and was the first person to apply officially for a license to run a hotel there. And he had to describe the hotel that he was going to operate in. That hotel, he said, had 4 bedrooms and 2 sitting rooms. But we know from the descriptions that were given to us, or we know from the assertions that were given to us by 2 independent witnesses, that is Churton and Brownlow, almost simultaneously but unknown to one another, that there was only one pub in town, and that one pub was the one that Churton described, and that was further described by Brownlow as having 4 bedrooms and 2 sitting rooms. Now, Brownlow only stayed for 6 months, because I think he was just a sort of a, itinerant pub manager, probably, I think, from that fellow in Rome, Mazarath. And so anyway, after 6 months, he decided to go, and if it was Mazarath who really owned the pub, he then had to find someone else, and he found another friend from Rome, and that was Robert Cooper. So Robert Cooper turned up in about September of 1865. He too applied for a license, and he too had to describe the building he was going to operate in. Still, only one hotel in town known, and that building that Cooper was going to operate in had 4 bedrooms and 2 sitting rooms. Well, it was said that he owned the pub, but of course I'm quite sure he didn't. But it was also said by the Janetskys that they built the pub for him, which clearly they couldn't have done. They also said that they bought the pub from him in, we'll say, 1866 or something like that. But we also know that that couldn't have happened. But nevertheless, the Janetskys in April, or 4 April of 1866, they had to describe the hotel that they were in, and of course that was the one that they were taking over from Robert Cooper, who in 1866 just disappears from the pages of history, apart from a mention in name of the 1869 court case that I will talk about, or have talked about so far. And again, the Janetskys described this hotel as being 4 bedrooms, and I think at that stage they said 3 sitting rooms. Now maybe Louis had in fact added an extra sitting room, whatever a sitting room in a bush pub may have been in 1866, I really do not know. Maybe Louis was responsible for the extra sitting room, and that may have given rise to the story that he built the hotel for Robert Cooper. But anyway, what we know is this. The hotel and the one building that was there in 1864 and in 1865 was the pub, that one building. We know it was the one building because of the licenses and so on. And ultimately we know where it was. Now, Janetzky doesn't say where it was. Cooper doesn't say where it was. They just say it was at Charleville. Well, if that's all we knew, then maybe we could say it had been at or was at Cowrie Crossing. But no. We then come to the second piece of evidence that we have, and that's the survey plan of Chester. Now, Chester's job involved doing the survey plan of the town, which was an important document in itself, but it was also very much a legal document. He was describing where the buildings were that existed at the time he did the survey. He had to do this because one of the purposes of the survey was to take the town, which had now been defined as a township rather than a reserve, and he had to divide it up into blocks so that the people who had established what they call improvements there from about 1865 could be given the right to buy them. And so he had to sort of shuffle his surveying around so that the improvements that were there were, able to be fitted neatly onto that plan so that in 1867 an auction could be undertaken so that those people could actually own their improvements, and they had a right to them. So Chester had the task of stating exactly where those early buildings were. So he designed his map, and you can see the map, and it extends between Gowrie Crossing and the upper crossing, Miller's Crossing. But if you look on that map, all of the buildings that were known at the time that Chester was there in 1866, and virtually the same buildings and only buildings were still there in 1868, are there on the map, Chester's map, in what we call now Alfred Street, on the western side of Alfred Street, bordering on the river, and adjacent to the upper crossing. Oh my God, I'm not long for this world, I'm sure. Excuse me. Now, if you look at the map does in fact include all the area between Gowrie Crossing and the upper crossing, Miller's Crossing. The buildings that were described by Chester were in that block going between Will Street and Burke Street. 3 of them were on the western side of the street, and only one of them was on the eastern side of the street. Once you got south of Will Street, it was like a sort of a never-never. And Gowrie Crossing was in the extreme never-never, and there was nothing there. There was no improvement, nothing to be defined that Chester was legally required to put on his map. So we can take that map of Chester's and we can see where those 4 buildings were. Now, what were they? He had surveyed a number of sections. Now, the first section was on the western side of Alfred Street, going from Will Street up to Burke Street. And then he divided it, I think, into 9 allotments. Now, allotment 1 was a shop owned by the Siemens of Roma. Then along from there, either 2 or 4, I'm not quite sure, probably 4, I think. There was a sort of a shanty or whatever, owned by Captain Lambert, Inspector Lambert, I think. And then we got up to number 6, allotment 6, and lo and behold, there is the pub. So we know that the pub that was there on Chester's map had been the pub that was there in 1865 and probably there also in 1864. But we do know exactly where that pub was, and that was on Section 1, Allotment 6. Okay. Well, of course, he went on and he had a smaller section, Section 2. They were slightly bigger. They were 1 acre. The ones on the western side, by the mathematics of surveying, had to be about 0.8 of an acre. And they sold for £6.10. The set price was £8 an acre. Allotment 1 in Section 2 was the Charleville Hotel. That was established in 1867. And that's where the Charleville Hotel still stands. And so that was at the corner of Alfred and Will Street on the eastern side, on that eastern corner. And they were the 4 buildings. The store, Section 1, Allotment 1. The Zeeman pub, which was the second pub in town, Section 2, Allotment 1. And then we can go up to the original pub, the Cooper's pub, the Janetzky pub, the Brownlow pub that ultimately became the Victoria Hotel. That was on Allotment 6. And if you want today to see with your own eyes where the town began, go to Eyre Street, walk down Eyre Street towards Alfred Street, and the building directly in front of you in Alfred Street on the western side is now Elders. And that's Allotment 6 of Section 1 of Chester's survey plan of the town. So we know from that one and the original building, that one building that served a number of masters, Brownlow, Cooper, Janetzky, then after the Janetskys, the Bradleys, and because they rented it for a while. And then after the Bradleys, then Mrs. Mary Janetzky came back, this time Mrs. Furlong, so it was run then by the Furlongs, or, sort of, they probably had tenants in there, of course, but it was sort of administered by the Furlongs. And then Mr. Furlong died, I think, in 1890, and it was that point that it came into the hands of Louisa through her father's will, and so it was then run by the Adrians right through, but of course, with tenants, right through until it burnt down in 1916. Although I think Mrs. Adrian had sold it by 1916, so it was another owner who owned it at the time that it burnt down. So when Mary Janetzky died in 1912, I think Louisa, who really wasn't really cut out for being, sort of a publican's organiser or publican's manager or whatever it may have been, she got rid of it as quickly as she can because she'd been well educated at All Hallows. She was a very musical, very cultured person, and having to put up with the goings on at that pub was probably a bit much for her, so she got rid of it. But what we do know from those two sources is that there was one building that had been there from 1864, and we also know that one building was the original building in town, and we know exactly where it was in town because Chester defined its location through his survey map. Well, the surprising thing about it all, of course, is this, that Father Flynn can assert that the town and the hotel began at Gowrie Crossing. In the same way, Alan Morrison says the same thing. Now look, they must have both walked up and down Alfred Street from time to time. I mean, I don't imagine that Father Flynn remained in seclusion in the presbytery, and I dare say that, well, I don't know where Alan Morrison lived, but he probably lived in one of the pubs. He could have lived at the New Victoria, for all I know. Where else might he have stayed? He may have stayed at the Gertie Steers School of Arts, because some teachers used to stay there. I don't know whether he would have stayed at the Charleville, but anyway, the thing was, both of them had to be in Alfred Street, and yet both of them can assert that the first building in town, the Janetzky pub, began at Gowrie Crossing. Well, that reminds me of the story of the House of Loretto. Now, the House of Loretto, the story goes like this. The Virgin Mary was born and lived in her early life, and the Annunciation took place in this, what we call the House of Loretto, in Nazareth. But, that part of the world became a bit wild and rough, and, oh dear, there was a lot of trouble. And in 1261, the angels decided that this was really not good enough. So in 1291, the house just disappeared. Well, the explanation is this. The angels came and picked up the house and carried it off to Croatia, first of all. I don't know how long it stayed in Croatia, but the angels obviously needed a bit of a break because it appears to have been a fairly heavy stone building. But anyway, eventually the angels took up their load again, and they transported to the town of Loretto in Italy. And so it's the only building in history that I know of that was actually transported a very large distance by the angels. It's the only building, and that building, I can assure you, was not the Janetzky Hotel. The angels did not move it from Gowrie Crossing to its position in Alfred Street near the upper crossing, and it was there always until it burned down in 1916 in Section 1, Allotment 6. And so the error about its being at Gowrie Crossing started way back in 1935, I think. Must have been, not 1935, 1938 with Father Flynn. I mean, it seems a strange thing to say. First of all, they had the evidence before their eyes of where the pub had been. But, I mean, they must have gone down to Gowrie Crossing also. Well, I mean, I was around roughly in those times. I mean, 1938, I was born in 1938. And I was certainly around when Alan Morrison came to Charleville. No, in 1943, I think Alan Morrison may still just have been there when I started school. But even so, in those years, you'd go down to Gowrie Crossing, and what did you find? There were only three things there. On the corner, just near the crossing, was Tomato Thompson's place. And Tomato Thompson had, a very high house and a lot of orange trees and man traps, so they say. It was said. Look, even my relatives did not dare to go and pinch fruit from Tomato Thompson's. Well, next door to them were the Chinese gardeners. Now, I know, although I don't tell anyone, this is family secret, my father's brothers used to pinch watermelons and God only knows what not from the Chinese gardeners, swine that my uncles were. The Chinese gardeners worked hard for their money. But they were there, and, well, Tomato Thompson is not exactly archaeological evidence, nor his house, nor his orange trees, nor his man traps. And I'm sure that the Chinese gardeners didn't think of themselves as archaeological evidence. And the only other thing there was that terrible damn cricket ground that was over there. I think they might have used it later on in the piece as sort of pony club ground, I think. But that's the one I mentioned, that, black soil, and you'd see these serpentine heat waves going up and madmen playing cricket in whites in December and January. I was always quite puzzled by that, But there was nothing else there, and who in their right minds would have built anything there, apart from Tomato Thompson in a very high house, and the Chinese, who in flood times and frequent flood times had each time to be rescued. So, no. There's no sign, there's no hint, no one ever says there was a bank there. No. Every building that you know of that has any history in town is up there near Burke Street. And so what I say may seem controversial to some, because the story of its beginning at Gowrie Crossing has been around ever since 1938. But if only they had listened, maybe even to Thomas McMahon, maybe they had listened to whoever told the 1929 version of Mrs. Adrian's story, the story would never have become distorted in the way it was. So there we are. Now, if you say, well, look, that old Bilby really does know what he's talking about, and he is getting on, and he makes some mistakes and all that sort of thing, and that's true, I can tell you. And usually when I review what I've recorded here, I have a look and I think, oh, no. My mind was wandering at that point. But anyway, if you think that my mind is wandering and I'm a bit, old and doddery and all that sort of thing, then just go to Trove and look up in Trove the National Library's search of colonial newspapers, and just check Charleville and name the pub, and give the years if you like, 1865, 1866, and so on, and you can get the definitions of the pub there. And then get a copy of the Chester map, and you'll find that one building that was defined in its nature in the license applications that are published in the newspapers and easily retrievable, you can discover from the Chester plan exactly where that place was. And so that will put it to an end. So you don't have to assume that the angels carried it from Gowrie Crossing to Alfred Street or where Elders is now. Now remember, of course, it remained where it is in, and certainly in 1943, 1947, 1938, and so on. It was still on allotment 6, but it burnt down in 1916. And the lady who owned it at that point decided the best thing to do was to just leave allotment 6 vacant, and she moved it next door to allotment 7. And allotment 6 remained vacant for quite a number of years, but when I was very young it had become the location of the swimming pool and skating rink, and I think the ladies' croquet club. And then next door to it, we used to call the one next door Hull's Hotel, I think. So it sort of migrated a little bit, but not by the angels. It migrated to allotment 7 only because of the fire. So there we are. Now that should clear it up, but, you don't necessarily need to believe what I say. I say that I think I'm right. But you may say, oh, you poor old thing, you've got senile or whatever. But you can always check. And if you find something else, if you find that, yes, it was crossing, good for you. You get on YouTube and you become, what do they call it? A YouTube influencer. Oh dear, I don't plan to be an influencer, that's for sure. Although, if I could, I think if you be an influencer, you go in for product placement. I'm not quite sure what my product would be. But nevertheless, I'm on the way, because I think I've got 2 likes and 1 follower. Oh my God, look, I'm on the way.